Valerie wasn't done asking questions. A few days later, Mark caught Donald watching him from across the school courtyard. Not the usual smug, mocking stare. Something different. "What's your deal?" Mark asked, approaching. Donald smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You think I haven't noticed my sister looking at you like she's figuring out a puzzle?" Mark kept his face neutral. "Valerie questions everything. That's not my fault." "Yeah, well," Donald said, crossing his arms. "She can ask questions. But you better give her the right answers." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Or what? You'll glare me into submission." Donald's smirk faltered. "I'm serious, man. I don't care what game you're playing. Valerie's smart, but she trusts people, sometimes too much." Mark tilted his head. "Funny, she doesn't trust you." Donald's jaw tightened. "Yeah, well, that's my problem." Mark watched him carefully. This wasn't the usual alpha male posturing. Donald was genuinely warning him. Which meant, despite everything, Donald still cared about his sister. Mark wasn't sure whether that would make Valerie more valuable to the Resistance or more vulnerable. Either way, this was only the beginning. The ethical dilemmas weren't over. The Silvers weren't done testing him. But Mark was ready. Because if there was one thing he was learning, it was this. Some choices would haunt him, and some choices would save him. He just had to figure out which was which before time ran out. Keeping secrets had never been a challenge for Mark, not until now. It wasn't just the strain of lying, though that was bad enough. It was the reality that every excuse, every half-truth, was another weight pressing down on him. The Resistance was forming, the time distortion was active, and humanity's survival depended on strategy. Yet here he was, navigating high school and dodging questions from the people closest to him. The Silvers had been firm. Secrecy was paramount. Any leaks, any missteps, and the Greys could accelerate their invasion. But Morris and Mark had reached a tipping point. Their web of deception was wearing thin, and if they didn't bring the right people in soon, their ability to operate discreetly would collapse. So they convinced the Silvers. Mark's family needed to know. Joe, the practical strategist, a good construction contractor. Mark's dad was calculating, methodical, and someone who never wasted time with nonsense. He was grounded enough to see past distractions and focus entirely on what mattered. If anybody could help form real strategies against the Greys, it was him. He wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but he knew how to read between the lines, which meant his growing suspicion about Mark's odd behavior wasn't going away. Keeping him in the dark would only cause problems. "You don't hide things from your parents," Morris had warned. "I am out of excuses to justify your absence on weekends and some weekday evenings." Mark's mom, the emotional anchor. Mark's mom had a gift for understanding people, for seeing deeper than what was on the surface. She was the heart of their home, the balance between logic and emotion, and the one person Mark could trust to make sure they weren't just fighting the war, but surviving it mentally. She wasn't some fragile, delicate figure who needed protecting. She had always carried herself with quiet strength, the kind that grounded people when things got messy. And things were about to get very messy. If Mark was going to stay sane through this, he needed her there. Sophie, the wild card. At first Morris had hesitated. "She's too young," he argued. "She doesn't need to know what's coming." But Mark fought for her inclusion. Because Sophie was pure-hearted but dangerously perceptive, she noticed everything. She had already suspected something was wrong, asking Mark too many questions he struggled to avoid. And if anyone was capable of keeping secrets, it was her. Sophie idolized Mark. If she was told how important this was, how dangerous, how crucial secrecy was, she would protect it with her life. The trusted friends, Ben and Jason. Mark had spent the last few weeks testing his closest friends, judging their ability to think fast, adapt, and work under pressure. And they had passed. Ben was analytical, tactical, always thinking 5 steps ahead, always considering possibilities others overlooked. His creativity made him an asset. Jason was reckless, but brilliant. Someone who might not always plan before acting, but had natural instincts in a crisis. He could improvise under pressure and thrive in chaos. These two were loyal, willing to follow Mark into any insane situation, and most importantly, they trusted him, even when things didn't make sense. If Mark was going to build something real, he needed them. The unorthodox choice, Miss Gooby. This was Mark's idea, and even he knew it was a stretch. A science teacher in the Resistance? Really? But he had his reasons. She was smart, far smarter than him or Morris when it came to understanding technology, chemistry, and engineering. She could help them recruit experts. Mark knew the Resistance would need specialists, explosives experts, geologists, engineers, chemists, and designers. Miss Gooby was perfectly positioned to help them find those people. 3. She was oddly perceptive. She had noticed things about Mark before, his thinking, his awareness, his sharpness. She wasn't blind to what was happening. She would be a good partner for Morris. Mark smirked at that last reason. You two would get along great. Morris had grumbled something about Mark playing matchmaker, but ultimately he agreed. Having someone with real scientific knowledge was crucial, especially once the Silvers gave them access to alien technology. There would be weapons to design, forts to build, bunkers to create, traps to set. And they needed the best minds for that. The Silvers accepted Mark's choices, but with strict conditions. Anybody who will learn the full truth, Silver One said, must receive the implant beforehand. Their mind must be linked to our network. Mark frowned. You mean mind reading? No, Silver 3 clarified. Monitoring. Protection. If they are captured or questioned by infiltrators, their knowledge must be safeguarded. Mark exchanged a glance with Morris. This is the price of knowing the truth, Morris murmured. Mark exhaled, nodding. Then it's time to start recruiting. It was happening. No more making excuses. No more dodging questions. The first members of the Resistance were about to be brought in. Mark wasn't just part of this anymore. He was leading it, and there was no turning back. The secret meeting was disguised as a very exclusive and casual pizza and sci-fi night, hosted at Morris's comic book store after hours. The place was packed with 10 open boxes of pizza, stacks of sodas, and a lingering scent of ink from decades-old comics lining the walls. The tension in the room was subtle but undeniable. Mark's family sat at one end of the table, unaware that they were on the verge of learning something that would change their lives forever. Joe leaned forward, absent-mindedly tapping his fingers against the wooden surface. His mom, always sharp, always reading the room, glanced between Mark and Morris with a quiet intensity. She knew something was coming. Sophie, younger, oblivious to the gravity of the moment, simply listened. Meanwhile, Ben and Jason occupied the other side, their usual banter filling the silence, tossing sarcastic remarks back and forth, treating the gathering like just another night hanging out, until they realized the atmosphere was different this time. Morris's unconventional inner circle. Then came Morris's trusted group, 3 men he had personally vouched for, selected not for their credentials, not for their influence, but for their unwavering ability to think outside the box. Anthony Berti, a retired cybersecurity specialist from Poland, 62 years old, still buried in comic books like they held the secrets of the universe itself. Alberto Martinez, 45, a drywall installer, a loyal regular at Morris's comic book store, someone who had spent decades questioning everything about the world. Marcial Cordona, 32, a security guard at the Dodgers Stadium, a conspiracy theorist at heart, a man who had always believed there was more to existence than what people were told. All 3 of them. Not scientists. Wealthy people to finance the movement. Not politicians. Not generals of war. Just men who had spent their lives questioning reality. Men whose minds operated differently. Men who, despite their unassuming backgrounds, had something far more valuable than official qualifications. Trust. Morris had vouched for them, had said, in this war, we need the brightest minds, not by credentials, but by ability to think beyond the obvious. Mark had exchanged a skeptical glance with Morris before sitting down. A silent thought was shared. This wasn't the best selection of people Earth had to offer, but it was the best one they had right now. And once the truth was revealed, Once the first group was set in motion, they would become more selective. For now, they had to trust the process. The moment before the truth. The room settled into silence, the weight of the moment pressing down, thicker than it had been moments ago. Mark took a slow breath. This was it. The first step toward unveiling what had been hidden, the first moment where certain people would become more than just civilians. They were about to learn the truth. And once they did, there would be no going back. The war was coming for all of them. And Earth needed every mind it could get, even the ones nobody ever expected. Because survival was never just about the strongest. It was about the smartest, and the ones who could see beyond the limits of logic itself. And tonight, that process was about to begin. Miss Gooby arrived later than the others, stepping into Morris's comic book store with careful curiosity. The soft glow of neon signs outside cast faint reflections across the glass, and the scent of old paper and fresh pizza hung in the air. Mark wasted no time. He locked the door behind her and gestured toward the long wooden table at the center of the store, the spot where discussions, debates, and occasionally heated arguments over comic lore usually took place. Tonight, however, it was the foundation of something much bigger. As he led her toward the group, Morris straightened instinctively. He wasn't expecting her to throw him off guard, but she did. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, poised, intelligent, completely in control. Or maybe it was the way her sharp green eyes flicked across the room with interest before settling on him for a fraction too long. Either way, Morris wasn't immune to the sudden awareness tightening in his chest. Mark introduced her smoothly, listing her credentials, her value to the group, why she was here. Morris nodded along, but his focus wasn't entirely on the words. It was on her. And if Miss Gooby noticed, well, she didn't seem in a hurry to look away either. It was going to be a very, very interesting night. Mark and Morris didn't dive straight into the truth. Instead, they started with a story. Morris took the lead, arms crossed as he paced slowly, letting the weight of his words sink in. So, Mark and I have been working on a project, something epic, something worth your time. Mark smirked, picking up where Morris left off. And honestly, we couldn't think of a better group of people to share it with. A few guests chuckled. Joe raised a skeptical eyebrow. Miss Gooby folded her arms, studying them. Then they began the tale of Urgumu, a thriving civilization across the galaxy, home to an advanced race that had lived in peace for thousands of years, until the Greys arrived. Their invasion wasn't instant, Morris explained, voice steady. It never is. Mark leaned forward. They spent decades infiltrating Urgumu's institutions, whispering into the ears of its leaders, spreading misinformation, dismantling alliances, destabilizing their defenses from within. And when Urgumu was weak, Morris's voice dropped lower. They struck. Morris continued with a serious face. The planet never stood a chance. The first wave of attack wasn't physical, it was technological. EMP blasts rendered every form of energy useless. Cities plunged into darkness. Governments crumbled overnight, unable to communicate, unable to control the rising panic. Then came the war droids. They don't feel fear, Mark said. They don't negotiate. They don't hesitate. The machines stormed the planet, absorbing bullets, crushing resistance before it could even form. And if that wasn't enough, the beasts followed. Predators from countless worlds, aggressive beasts, each one engineered to perceive the natives as prey. The streets of Urgumu ran red, the screams of its people swallowed by the merciless creatures hunting them down. And after the planet was broken? Morris sighed, shaking his head. Then came the Greys. Joe tightened his jaw, listening intently. Sophie clutched her soda cup with both hands. Ben and Jason were locked in, their usual jokes forgotten. The Greys don't just kill, Mark said. They enslave. Those who surrendered were forced to labor endlessly, reshaping their homeworld to suit their new masters. The planet was stripped of its natural beauty, its cities redesigned to accommodate the growing population of Grey warriors eager to claim their new territory. The few who resisted were hunted, executed. Urgumu became another grey colony, indistinguishable from thousands of other fallen civilizations across the galaxy. And that, Morris said, exhaling, is what happens when a world doesn't fight back. Silence. For a moment, nobody spoke. Jason added, "If this is an idea for a movie, I think a different kind of alien would be nice. Greys are tiny and fragile." Nobody said a word for 3 minutes. Then, Joe narrowed his eyes. "That's not just a story, is it?" Mark hesitated. For all the whispers, the theories, the hints that something bigger was unfolding, nothing could compare to the undeniable power of a demonstration. And Morris knew that talking wasn't enough. Words could be debated, facts could be dismissed. But seeing changed everything. With practiced ease, Morris unzipped the duffel bag, reached inside, and pulled out the gravity gizmo. A piece of technology so foreign to Earth's understanding that its very existence shattered everything they thought they knew. He activated it without hesitation, the device humming to life with a faint vibration, its energy field wrapping around him like an unseen force, defying reality. Then, with the agility of a trained acrobat, he bent down, pressed his weight onto the tips of his fingers, balanced his entire body with unnatural stability. And in a single, effortless movement, he jumped. Not high, not fast, just enough to hover, his body suspended in the air, weightless, moving without effort, defying gravity itself. At that moment, every doubt was erased, every skeptical thought vanished. The room fell into stunned silence, eyes wide, breath caught in disbelief. No more theories, no more speculation. Morris had just rewritten reality right in front of them. Joe gasped, his chair scraping against the floor as he leaned forward, staring like he had just seen a miracle unfold before his eyes. Ben and Jason, speechless. For the first time in their lives, they had nothing sarcastic to say. Anthony Bertie, the conspiracy veteran, sat back with a deep satisfaction. Because after years of questioning the world, after decades of suspecting that reality was far more complicated than what people were told, he was finally proven right. And Mark? Mark felt it in his bones. This was only the beginning. Because now that they believed, now that they understood, they were about to step into something far bigger than they could ever imagine. And the war? The war had just found its newest recruits. And there was no turning back now, not ever.